If you go looking for how many parents are estranged from their adult children, you'll find a number within about 30 seconds. And then, if you keep looking, you'll find a different number, and then a third, 15%, 27%, 35%, almost 40% in some surveys. And if you're a parent living inside this right now, that gap isn't just confusing, it's exhausting, because it makes you feel like even the researchers can't agree on how big your pain is, let alone what to do about it. So here's what I want to do in this video. I want to actually take you inside why those numbers disagree, because the reason is more useful than you'd expect. And then I want to show you the numbers almost nobody puts in a headline, the ones about who tends to get estranged, why, and, most importantly, what the actual odds are that this gets better. Because by the end of this, I don't just want you to understand the epidemic. I want you to have an actual, evidence-based sense of what to do next. So let's start with the confusion itself, because it's not random, and once you understand it, everything else gets clearer. The reason estrangement statistics swing so wildly between studies comes down to something almost embarrassingly simple. Researchers aren't measuring the same thing. A developmental psychologist named Lucy Blake, who's done some of the most careful review work in this field, pointed out exactly this problem, that studies define estrangement completely differently from one another. Some studies count any cutoff contact with any family member, including aunts, uncles, cousins, in-laws. Other studies narrow it down specifically to immediate family, just parents and their own children. Some count total silence only. Others count relationships that are technically still active but functionally hollow, a birthday text once a year, nothing more. This is why Cornell sociologist Karl Pillemer's widely cited 2020 study found that 27% of American adults had cut off contact with a family member. But that number includes the whole extended family tree, not just parents and children directly. Meanwhile, a 2024 Harris poll conducted in collaboration with psychologist Joshua Coleman, who's become one of the leading researchers in this specific field, found that 35% of the more than 1,000 adults surveyed reported being estranged specifically from an immediate family member, a parent or a sibling. Different question, different number, both accurate for what they were actually measuring. I want to pause on this because I think it matters more than it looks like it does. If you're a parent who has felt alone in this, thinking maybe your situation is rare, or maybe it's so common it barely counts as real pain anymore, neither extreme is true. The honest answer, once you cut through the definitional noise, is that parent-child estrangement specifically, not the extended family version, likely affects somewhere in the range of 1 in 10 to 1 in 4 families, depending on exactly how you draw the line. That's not a fringe experience. Coleman himself, who has spent decades studying this and has lived through his own daughter's estrangement and eventual reconciliation, has a term for what this actually is, given how common it is and how rarely anyone discusses it openly. He calls it a silent epidemic, not because it's rare, because it's common and almost nobody talks about it out loud. Now here's the first statistic I don't think gets nearly enough attention, and it's one that reframes a lot of what people assume about who gets estranged and why. A study Coleman references found that roughly 1 out of every 4 fathers is estranged from an adult child, and that fathers are 22% more likely to be estranged from a daughter than from a son. Mothers, in that same study, were estranged from a child at a much lower rate, around 6%, though Coleman notes that other research puts the number for mothers closer to 10 to 15%, which he considers a more accurate range based on his own clinical experience. Sit with that gap for a second, because I think it quietly explains a lot of individual pain that people assume is somehow their own personal failure. If you're a father estranged from a daughter specifically, you are, statistically, in one of the single most common configurations of this entire phenomenon. Not an outlier, not someone who did something uniquely wrong, but part of the most frequently occurring pattern researchers have actually found. That doesn't erase the pain, but it does something important. It moves the question away from, what is uniquely broken in me, and toward, what is it about this particular relationship dynamic that shows up so often across so many unrelated families? So let's actually answer that question, because the research does point to some real, specific mechanisms. And this is the part I think almost nobody explains clearly enough to parents who are living inside it. The single mechanism with the strongest research backing behind it is divorce. Multiple studies converge on this finding. Divorce significantly increases the risk of parent-child estrangement, and it does so through several distinct pathways, not just one. Sometimes it happens through what researchers and clinicians call parental alienation. One parent, consciously or not, shaping how a child interprets the other parent's behavior during and after a divorce in ways that harden into adult estrangement years later. Sometimes it happens without any deliberate alienation at all. Adult children, looking back on a divorce as adults, independently assign blame to one parent based on their own memory and interpretation of what happened, sometimes inaccurately, sometimes not. And sometimes it happens through something more structural. New partners entering the picture, step-siblings and step-parents competing for emotional and financial resources, the family unit fragmenting into pieces that no longer share the same center of gravity. If your estrangement followed a divorce, somewhere in your family's history, this matters enormously, because it means the estrangement likely isn't purely a referendum on your parenting in isolation. It's very often a delayed aftershock of a family structure that fractured years earlier, working its way through a system that hasn't finished absorbing the original break. The second mechanism worth naming directly, because I think it's the one parents are the least prepared for, involves therapy. This is a genuinely sensitive area, and I want to be careful here, because good therapy saves relationships and saves lives, including inside families dealing with real, serious harm. But Coleman's research and clinical experience point to something specific and worth understanding. Some therapists, operating from an entirely well-intentioned framework focused on individual healing, can end up validating a client's decision to cut off contact as an act of self-protection, even in situations where the parent being cut off is willing to take accountability, make changes, and repair the relationship. Coleman has written that this pattern appears to be increasing. Therapists supporting estrangement even from parents actively trying to make amends. Not because therapists are careless, but because a therapeutic culture increasingly built around validating a client's felt experience doesn't always have built-in space for considering the other person's capacity to change. I'm not telling you this to make you suspicious of therapy, your child's or your own. I'm telling you because if you're a parent wondering, did a therapist play a role in this? The honest answer is, possibly. And that doesn't necessarily mean anyone acted in bad faith. It means the mechanism is real and worth understanding rather than being surprised by. The third mechanism, which we've touched on in earlier episodes but deserves its own weight here, is a genuine generational shift in values. Specifically, a shift toward evaluating relationships, including family relationships, based on how they feel rather than the role someone occupies. Coleman describes this using a phrase that captures the paradox well. Even as more adult children increasingly want to relate to their parents as friends rather than figures of pure obligation, a growing number of parents are simultaneously experiencing rejection from those same children. The relationship model shifted towards something that requires ongoing emotional safety to sustain itself. And when that safety isn't consistently felt, on either side, distance becomes a more available response than it once was. Now, I promised you the numbers that almost never make it into headlines. And this is the part of the video I think matters most, because everything up to this point has been about understanding the problem. This part is about what to actually do with that understanding. Here is the statistic I think every parent living through this needs to hear clearly, because it rarely gets the same airtime as the estrangement numbers themselves. Research from sociologist Rin Rexek at Ohio State University, studying reconciliation specifically, found that the substantial majority of estranged parents eventually experience some form of reconciliation with their child, with estimates for mothers reaching around 80% and a majority of fathers as well, though at a somewhat lower rate. Estrangement, in other words, is far more often a chapter than an ending. That doesn't mean it resolves quickly, and it doesn't mean every single case reconciles. But the dominant pattern in the actual research is distance followed by eventual reconnection, not distance followed by permanence. So if reconciliation is the more common outcome, what actually predicts whether it happens? This is where Coleman's clinical work becomes genuinely practical, because he's studied not just why estrangement happens, but what specific parental behaviors correlate with successful reconciliation attempts. The first is what Coleman calls an amends letter, a specific, structured piece of written communication that differs sharply from the instinctive things most parents try first. An effective amends letter, according to Coleman's research and clinical guidance, does a few very particular things. It doesn't lead with the parent's own pain, even though that pain is real and valid. It doesn't include justifications, context, or, but you have to understand my side, even when the parent's side genuinely has merit. Instead, it focuses almost entirely on acknowledging the child's experience, specifically and without qualification, in language that doesn't get diluted by a follow-up but. Something closer to, I understand that when I did X, it made you feel Y, and I'm sorry for the impact that had. Full stop, rather than, I understand you felt hurt, but I was going through a hard time too. Coleman's research and casework consistently find that the second version, however true it might be, tends to shut reconciliation attempts down rather than open them, because it reads to the child as self-defense, wearing the costume of an apology. The second predictor is patience, measured in a completely different unit than most parents expect. Coleman's clinical experience points to reconciliation timelines that are often measured in years, not months, and even then, frequently nonlinear. Contact resuming, pausing again, resuming again, in a pattern that can look like failure in the moment but is actually a completely normal part of how these relationships tend to heal. Parents who treat every renewed silence after a hopeful moment as proof that reconciliation has failed permanently often, according to Coleman's observations, make the eventual reconciliation harder, because their own emotional whiplash puts pressure back onto the child at exactly the moment the child needed to feel like distance was still safely available to them. The third predictor, and I think this one is the most emotionally demanding, is a parent's genuine capacity to sit with the possibility that their own account of the past may not match their child's account of the same events. Not because either person is lying, but because memory, especially memory of childhood, is reconstructed rather than replayed. And two people living through the same household can walk away with entirely different internal records of what happened there. Coleman's research on what he calls curated trauma narratives in modern estrangement doesn't dismiss those narratives as false. It treats them as psychologically real to the person holding them, which means a parent's accuracy about, that's not how it happened, is often far less useful in terms of actually rebuilding the relationship than a parent's willingness to sit inside the discomfort of, I hear that this is how it happened for you. I want to be honest about something here, because I don't think it's fair to present all of this as simple, three-step advice that guarantees an outcome. Some estrangements involve real, serious harm. Abuse, addiction, situations where distance is genuinely the safest and healthiest choice for the adult child, and where reconciliation, if it happens at all, needs to be built on real accountability, not just technique. If that's your situation, the amends letter framework still applies in spirit, but the deeper work is likely to require actual behavior change over time, not just better worded communication. I don't want anyone watching this to hear, just write a better letter as a substitute for the harder internal work some situations genuinely require. But for the very large number of estrangements that don't stem from serious abuse, the ones that stem from accumulated hurt, generational value differences, divorce aftershocks, or a values gap that widens slowly over years without either side fully noticing. The research is fairly consistent on what tends to help and what tends to make things worse. What tends to help. Patience measured in years rather than weeks. Communication that centers the child's experience without immediately pivoting to self-defense. Consistency without pressure. Letting your child know the door is open at a low, steady frequency, without repeated attempts that can start to feel like pursuit rather than invitation. And, where it's genuinely available to you, professional support. Not necessarily to fix the relationship directly, but to help you sit with the grief of this period without projecting that grief back onto your child in ways that make reconciliation less likely. What tends to make it worse, according to Coleman's clinical observations, defensiveness disguised as explanation. Reaching out only during moments of your own emotional crisis, which can feel to an estranged child like the relationship is being reopened for the parent's benefit rather than a genuine repair. And perhaps most damaging, treating every attempt at contact as a referendum on whether the relationship is fully back, rather than accepting that reconciliation, when it happens, is very often gradual, tentative, and easily disrupted by too much too soon. There's also a resource layer to this that I think deserves mention, because so many parents go through this in complete isolation, which the research suggests makes the whole experience measurably harder to bear. Support networks specifically built for estranged parents have grown significantly in recent years. Organizations like PE, which stands for Parents of Estranged Adult Kids, and Stand Alone, both of which exist specifically to give parents in this situation a community that understands the particular, ambiguous nature of this grief, the kind we talked about in our episode on Seneca. If you haven't sought out a space like that yet, and you're carrying this largely alone, I genuinely encourage you to look into it. Not because a support group fixes the estrangement itself, but because isolation tends to intensify exactly the anxious, defensive posture that research shows makes reconciliation less likely, while community tends to give people enough steadiness to approach their child with more patience than panic. So here's what I want to leave you with, because I promised at the start of this video that it wouldn't just be numbers. It would be something you could actually use. If you're living inside this right now, 3 things are true simultaneously, according to the best research we have. First, you are far from alone, and the confusing spread of statistics doesn't mean researchers can't agree on your pain. It means estrangement takes different shapes, and yours is a real, measurable, common one. Second, the specific mechanism behind your estrangement. Whether it traces back to a divorce years ago, a therapeutic relationship that validated distance, or a genuine generational shift in what your child needs from family, matters because it changes what repair actually requires, and understanding which one applies to you is worth real reflection rather than guessing. And third, the one I think matters most, the dominant outcome in the actual research isn't permanent loss. It's eventual reconciliation, most often built slowly, through patience, through communication that centers your child's experience over your own defense of it, and through a willingness to hold 2 different versions of the same history without needing yours to win. That third point is the one I most want you to walk away with. This isn't a guarantee. Nothing about this is guaranteed, and I'd be doing you a disservice if I pretended otherwise. But if the statistics are honest with us about anything, it's this. The story most families in this situation are actually living is not gone forever. It's not yet. And not yet is a very different thing to build a life around than never. If this gave you something concrete to actually work with, not just to understand your pain, but to know what to do with it, that's exactly what this channel exists for. The third voice is here to keep bringing you the research and the reflection that turns this particular ache into something you can actually act on, not just carry. So if you want the next episode when it's ready, subscribe, because we're going to keep going deeper into exactly this kind of practical ground. Next time, we're going to build directly on what we covered here, a full breakdown of what an effective amends letter actually looks like, sentence by sentence, and the specific language that tends to open a door instead of closing it further. That's next time, here on The Third Voice.